Okay, good afternoon. Thanks for sticking around. My name is Jaroslav, and this is my first ever conference keynote. I used to get into conferences the proper and fair way through peer review, but this time I was offered a shortcut. The organizers actually had confidence in me even before I showed them the content of this talk. So I'm very grateful for that confidence, and I hope I won't disappoint it too much. And I also want to take advantage of this liberty that I can take, not having gone through peer review, to actually engage in some speculation, which you usually, are not supposed to do when you're going through peer review. So, as some of you may know, most of my research has been on the history of games, of computer games, in communist Czechoslovakia in the 1980s. Right now, I'm doing research on video game monsters, but that's sort of like a new project. But this has been what I was working on for a long time. And I've currently finished the manuscript of a book that's called Gaming the Iron Curtain. It's supposed to come out next year, hopefully. I'm under contract with MIT Press. And this is not the actual cover, just so you know. Okay, so I was doing research for this book for about 10 years, on and off, but mostly on. I was going through pages of dog-eared copies of game design journalists from people in the 1980s and computer club newsletters. I also did a lot of interviews. I did around 40 interviews for this book. And I made a point out of it per recommendations of sort of oral history methodology to actually meet all the people in person. So I did a lot of traveling around the country, which is, former Czechoslovakia is not a big country. But there was a lot of traveling. I kind of got a feeling for different parts of the country as well. This is a picture taken in Kutty in Slovakia, which is not far from here. This was 6 a.m. I was on my way to meet one of my informants. And this is actually one of the most pleasant memories I have of doing the research. Just seeing this, beautiful train station at 6 a.m. So to get back to the title is called of this talk is called "We Have Always Been Indie," and this time, so I've already sort of written and presented about different aspects of history of games in Czechoslovakia. Actually, in one of those books that are over there, maybe still in the blue conference proceedings from 2011, there's a chapter that I wrote about informal distribution of software in the 1980s Czechoslovakia, so how people were passing around software on cassette tapes. But this time I kind of want to be a bit more general and talk about sort of general questions about creativity, independence and activism and all of this in digital games. And let me start with the title, We Have Always Been Indie. I'm a big fan of this book called We Have Never Been Modern by Bruno Latour, who's a sociologist of science, sociologist in general and a philosopher. And this has inspired a lot of my work. And the subject matter of this book is pretty dry and pretty removed from the topic of my research, but just bear with me for a moment. It starts with a discussion of science in the 18th century and the modes of production of knowledge. And Latour's point in this book is that modernism created this sort of artificial distinction between the material world and the world of man. And in order to justify people's dominance over nature, it divided the world into two. And this is the root of many of today's problems, especially climate change. And Latour has also written about climate change recently. So modernism divided the sphere of man from the sphere of nature, and humanities and social sciences from natural sciences, and so on. And this is an extremely important message, but I want to sort of use sort of like a more conceptual thing that I borrowed or stole from Latour besides the title. So he shows that for a long time, our beliefs about the relationship between people and things were built on shaky ground, customary beliefs, and false distinctions. So he argues that we have actually never been modern. We were living a lie, and this sort of whole distinction was a lie. It was an illusion. And now I want to apply this conceptual approach to indie games. So indie games have been around for some time. The term is pretty popular. We're all familiar with this term. Its meaning is a bit unclear. There have been some interesting, brilliant articles about it by Jesper Juhl from 2014, High-Tech, Low-Tech Authenticity, by Maria Garda and Pavel Grabarczyk, Is Every Indie Game Independent, and so on. I'll mostly draw from these two articles. So they're trying to define what an indie game is. And they kind of converge on these three basic points. Indie games are financially independent. So that means that the publisher doesn't dictate or financially invest into the product. They're creatively independent, so there's nobody telling the programmers and the developers what to do. And this is sort of tied to this kind of moral aesthetic claim that these games are potentially more personal, maybe more artistic, because you don't have these constraints. Also, the idea of the auteur, of like a sort of single individual kind of romantic author that can push forward his kind of idea of what he wants to, or he or she wants to do with the game. And the third point, elaborated especially by Jesper Juhl, is that there is a particular indie style. So there are these markers that we associate with indie games, such as pixel graphics, 2D graphics, particular themes, and they often tend to be about sort of more personal things than mainstream games. But there is something that is sort of bothering me about this idea of indie games, and that is the fact that, and both Jesper Juhl and Garda and Grabarczyk kind of come to this conclusion that there seems to be a need to differentiate indie games from other games. And this, once again, kind of brings me back to my memories of my university years. I studied linguistics at Charles University in Prague. And so obviously we were taught a lot about the Prague School of Linguistics, which is a structuralist school of linguistics that was very interested in the binary oppositions in language. And it has been extremely influential on other disciplines as well, through people like Roman Jakobson and Jan Mukařovský, so also towards aesthetics and so on. And the idea that I want to borrow is the opposition between unmarked and marked elements in language and in culture. So we can see, like in language, there might be a marked form, which adds something to the original word. So, actor is an unmarked form, and actress, which is a feminine form, is a marked one. So it can be the other way around, The feminine can be unmarked, and, we can sort of discuss the political, implications of sort of this how language came to be later, maybe. But you can see that it can be the other way around. So you have a marker that's saying, okay, this is a masculine, and I think it's a bit similar with games. So when we speak about games without a qualifier, we tend to mean a mainstream game, a commercial game, an industrial game, and in order to differentiate indie games from the mass of games, we use the qualifier indie. Yeah, let me just... Okay, sorry about that. Yeah. So I do not mean in any way to attack commercial games. I love them. I love the spectacle. I love the escapist joy that they offer. I'm very much looking forward to playing Shadow of War, for instance. But I think that treating these games as default games really kind of traps us in a narrow understanding of what games can do and what games can be. And this is something that indie game developers and critics sort of have been advocating. And I'm specifically fond of this book by Anna Anthropy from 2012, who some of you may be familiar with. It's called A Rise of the Video Game Zinesters: How Freaks, Normals, Amateurs, Artists, Dreamers, Dropouts, Queers, Housewives, and People Like You are taking back an art form. Anna Entropy is an indie game designer, experimental game designer, and she made games like Dysphoria, which is very, very influential sort of experimental game title. And in this book, she encourages the readers to take back the art form of video games and make games that are more personal. There is a very nice chapter in this book, which is called What to Make a Game About. And Entropy answers. Your dog, your cat, your child, your boyfriend, your friends, your imaginary friends, your summer vacation, your winter in the mountains, your childhood home, your current home, your future home, and she goes on and on and on. It has like, it's 5 pages of things that you can write games about, and no mention of orcs and elves and and zombies, but just like regular things that you can make your games about. So I'll get back to this list a bit later. But right now I want to focus on the taking back part, which is interesting. I think she's kind of implying that there was some bygone time somewhere in the past when games actually belong to the people. And it's an interesting idea, but she doesn't really develop it that much in this book. But in fact, she wrote another book called ZZT, which is about the game called ZZT. Does anybody know the game ZZT? It's a pretty obscure game. It was made in the early 90s. It's sort of like a very modifiable kind of action-adventure game that's all in ASCII. And it was a shareware game, which means that a part of it was distributed for free on floppies or through BBSs, so the pre-internet computer networks. So possibly, when she's talking about taking back, maybe she's referring to this time, to the 1990s, the shareware scene when people, on computers were creating games like ZZT, a very powerful game made by people who later actually went on to create the Unreal Engine. But we can go even further back to the 1960s and 70s. And see that very influential titles like Moonlander from 1969 was not an industrial production. It was made by one high school student on a mainframe computer in 1969, and then it spawned all these copies and clones by Atari and some other commercial companies. But originally, it was an amateur game. The same goes for Adventure, probably the first narrative-based game. The first text adventure that kind of started the whole genre, written in 1975 to 1976 by 2 people, William Crowther and Don Woods. And interestingly enough, it was sort of an open source game too, because first Crowther kind of created the base game, and he gave it away for free, and then Don Woods sort of improved it and worked on it a little bit, and then we have like the adventure game, or sometimes it's called Colossal Cave Adventure, in its sort of most well-known form. So it was an open source game. It started a genre. It was not an industrial product at all. And in fact, it was inspired by Crowther's own experience with exploring caves. So he explored caves in real life, and he wrote a game about it. And this brings me in a very kind of roundabout way to the topic of my research and my book. To communist Czechoslovakia, a country where there was no industry because there was no market. It was a country behind the Iron Curtain. So it was not easy to be a fan of computers or games in 1980s Czechoslovakia. The few computers that we had, like these ones, the IQ-151 and the PMD-85, were sort of less powerful and uglier copies of the Western machines. To make things even worse, you couldn't even buy them in stores. There were so few of them produced that you couldn't buy them in retail. They were only produced for schools and for institutions, so you couldn't really buy these. If you wanted to buy your own home computer, you had to know somebody who could bring it to you from the West, and not everybody could do that. Or you could line up in these long queues, overnight queues, in these special stores with imported goods, and try to get a hold of one. So computers were very scarce, but many people still, especially electronics hobbyists and kids, really wanted these computers. And despite these limitations, tens of thousands of people in a 15 million strong country had home computers around 1985. So there were no shops, no computer or gaming magazines, and most activity around games and computers took place in computer clubs. And the computer clubs were often state-sponsored and targeted at young people. Just an explanation. So I said that the communist government was unable to produce computers for the citizens, but at the same time, they did believe in the power of computing, and especially for industrial applications and for the military. So they were basically training kids to become programmers to then work in the industries, the heavy industry, like manufacturing industries, or in the military. What actually happened in those clubs was something really different. And we can see an example here. So this is a grammar school student, František Fuka, showing his friends at the Station of Young Technicians his own new creation, a computer game. So you can see that the guys are in awe, of what they see on the screen. You can also see that they're all guys. So like in the West, like in Eastern Europe, it was very similar. There were very few women involved in hobby computing, which is a shame, but it was like that. What did people play, and what did people do with computers? The most popular computer back then in Czechoslovakia was the Sinclair. The Sinclair ZX Spectrum. The Sinclair ZX Spectrum, you can see it on the left. It was imported from the UK. It was a British computer. So people were, playing these games produced in Great Britain, such as Manic Miner, sort of the British Mario, or the British Super Mario Brothers, which actually preceded Super Mario Brothers in time. Or games like Terra Questa, which was sort of a shooter game based on a Japanese arcade game, and it was really cool, and it animated really fast. And this was one of the games that Czechoslovak players really loved and wanted to imitate. So they were not only playing other people's games; they were also copying them, passing them around on cassette tapes, which I've already mentioned. The informal distribution network was very efficient. So it took only around 1 week for a piece of software to get from one end of the country to the other. So it means that there was this, even without the internet, you could spread games and software pretty fast. And not only British games or American games or Spanish games that were also popular, but also games made in the country. So there was this strong emphasis in the computer clubs on making rather than just playing games. So there was this sort of like strong drive for kids to learn programming. So people were imitating Western titles. You can see a Star Fox was kind of like a run-of-the-mill 2D shooter game, but the way in which it succeeded in imitating Western games was actually quite amazing. It showed the ingenuity of the domestic programmers. They were usually kids. They were usually, 12 to 20 years old, and they really had no formal education in machine code and in programming for these computers. So the fact that they could pull it off was pretty amazing. So they were creating, clones and ports of Western games, and they were also creating adaptations of non-digital games that were popular in the country, such as the Czechoslovak version of Tic-Tac-Toe. And I don't know what the Austrian version is like, but the Czech one, called Piškvorky, is actually played on a potentially infinite grid. What is it like in Austria? No? Yeah, so the Czech version is played like you played at school, and you played on a potentially infinite grid, right? So it's like an open world tic-tac-toe. There was an adaptation of that for the Spectrum, and it was like one of the most popular domestic games. So this was one category. But sorry about that, well, we can stay here. Over half of the games produced in Czechoslovakia at that time were text adventures. So text-based games with a lot of narrative in which you sort of enter commands, via typing on the keyboard to the character who then carries them out. And this is interesting because these games are heavy on narrative. So what were these people writing about? And one of my informants summed it up this way. We were writing things that made sense to us and that also made sense to our audience, the friends around us, which kind of sounds very natural, but there's no, as we talked about it in case of indie games, there's no publisher pressure. There's some peer pressure, for sure, but yeah, and there's no kind of financial pressure. They were making games for themselves, basically. This is one of the first Czechoslovak text adventures, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, from 1985. Here's a translation of the text. So Indiana Jones became a very popular character in Czechoslovak text adventures. Obviously, like all of these games were not licensed, but I guess like George Lucas didn't really, it was under his radar, and he didn't sue, these guys in Czech Computer Club, so they could, continue making these games. There were, over a dozen games made around about Indiana Jones, who was sort of like this cult, Western, iconic hero for, Czechoslovak kids. The movies were actually shown in the theaters in Czechoslovakia. But not all of them were, about, action heroes. Some of them were about these things. Dogs, cats, friends, imaginary friends, your current home, your future home. Some of these, and I'll give some examples in a minute, some of these actually took place in the very apartments or neighborhoods or schools where these people lived or went to school. And I call these games hyperlocal games, and this is going to be sort of like the first category that I think is really interesting to think about when thinking about the past of indie games. And I define hyperlocal games as games created by people from a particular place, about that place, and about the people who inhabit that place, written mainly for the local community. And this is just an adaptation of the definition of hyperlocal media in general. It's a well-known term in media studies. And now I kind of want to go back a little bit, because I really enjoyed the presentation yesterday by Jakub Veniš. Is he still here? Oh, yeah. So I really like that. And so you were saying that you sort of made this engine for 2D point-and-click adventure games, and the demo game you made was about you kind of writing the high school thesis, right? Yeah. So that's really interesting, right? Like this was the first thing that came to Jakub's mind when he was making a game. And this made me think of another game, which is a bit later, but I think I just want to use the example right now. It's called The Secret of Donkey Island, and it's a parody of The Secret of Monkey Island. It's sometimes considered the first commercially released Czech or Czechoslovak game for the PC. And I know the authors, and I've interviewed them as well. So they were creating an engine, just as Jakub was. And when they were testing out the engine, they actually made a game about their high school, and about their high school teachers and about their high school friends. And then when they saw that the engine was working, they scrapped the game about high school and they created a game about pirates. And I liked the game, but I'm thinking, yeah, maybe a game about high school would be more interesting, or maybe it would have been at least like for a historian, it would have been more valuable to know, about what was happening in their lives, not in the life of Guybrush Threepwood, despite me like really liking this, enjoying this game. But in the 1980s, there weren't really any conventions, or let's say strong conventions, about what you should make your games about. And one of the interesting hyperlocal games is called Demon in Danger, published in 1988 by a guy who went under the moniker Demon Software. And this is the opening, this is the intro of the game. On November 13th, 1988, a strange person appeared in the village of Chleby, which is where he lived. He was wearing an army uniform and a military hat. Those who know games for the ZX Spectrum recognize him as Dan Dare, a comics hero. He was an agent of the studio Fuchsoft, constructed by František Fuka. We had seen Fuka before. He was also a member of the community, of the programmer community in the 1980s. His mission was to plant a bomb into the apartment of the competing studio Demon, that is, into the apartment of Martin Malý. So in this game, Martin Malý, that's the Demon Soft guy, his apartment was rigged with explosives, and you, as one of his high school friends, are supposed to enter the apartment and defuse the bombs. And the game actually features a very, very faithful recreation of Malý's apartment at that time. So this is the village of Chleby, east of Prague, not too far from Prague. This is the building where the game took place. It's still there. And this is the map of the game that I drew while I was playing the game. So you can see that it's actually a pretty realistic recreation of where he was living at that time. I think it's like historically valuable, and I think it's sort of conceptually interesting what he did. Let me now give you another example. So hyperlocal games were primarily made for friends in the local community, but many of them reached a wider audience and became quite popular. And the subgenre became quite popular, and this trend continued well into the 1990s. And there's one game that's particularly interesting, also because it's political in a way. It's called Stodman. It was written by Jan Lonsky in 1992. Stod is a small town west of Pilsen in the Czech Republic. And this game is a hyperlocal game with sort of like this punk rock edge to it. The guy, Jan Lonsky, was a fan of punk rock music besides being a programmer. He was studying at high school, and he made a game that took place in that high school. And let us now listen to what he has to say about the game.
Postava je hrdina. Tady je dobrý zmínit, že jsem se s tou postavou ne úplně na začátku, ale někdy během vymýšlení hry identifikoval. Takže jde vlastně o mě. Respektman byl Pája Korbel. Hlavní hrdina Stodman se dostane do školní budovy, zapadnou za ním dveře, zamknou se. V té školní budově musí získat materiály z výslechů Stodmana a Respektmana a tyto materiály v příslušné datové podobě poslat tajné organizaci, která zajistí chycení a potrestání příslušných viníků. A posledním úkolem je uniknout z budovy školy. Stodman měl svůj image. Charakterizovali ho tmavý brejle, opět 80. léta, klasický kulatý brejle, koženková nebo kožená bunda, kolty, klasika rifle, co se tenkrát nosilo, obušek Respekt, právě od Respektmana, a často byl Stodman zobrazovaný ve výkopu a la Van Damme, jistě tu jednu nohu nahoře nad hlavou a s roztočeným Respektem. Malý Jan, dokud je malej, potřebuje chránit. Potřebuje nějakou berličku nebo nějakou posilu. Takže tohle, to, co vidíte, je fantazie. Na druhou stranu, tuhle bundu jsem nosil skutečně, podobný brejle jsem nosil skutečně, nikoliv jako ochranu fyzickou, ale jako spíš způsob psychického zastrašování. Pixla zakomplexovaná byla výchovná poradkyně, skutečný jméno Ivanka Nosková. Přestože zní takhle roztomilé, tak ta paní měla na svědomí mě takhle s tím pájou, jak se pokusila nás, jak řekněme, dostat do spárů psychiatra. Vždycky si z ročníku někoho vyhlídla, přesvědčila ho nebo ho uvrtala do nějakého problému a pak ho posílala do poradny do Havlovic.
Okay, so this was from a documentary that's being made about this game and some other games from 1980s Czechoslovakia, and I collaborated on that documentary. So there is something very mundane about this game. It leads the player from the train station in Stod into the school. It draws on the everyday experience of going to that school. It's actually a pretty fun game, well programmed and reasonably well designed. But now we also know that the story was sort of an immediate reaction to the abuse that the authors were suffering from, the school's sponsor and the staff in general. And the game allowed them to relive this experience from a different point of view. So they returned to the school as Stodman, as this superhero, who can now sort of, exercise his agency over this space to strike back against, those who strip them of their dignity. So as he puts it himself, we weren't weak. We had our own powers and abilities. One of them was the ability to express ourselves in a way that cannot be intercepted by them. And by them, he meant the teachers. And obviously, the teachers didn't really know that a computer game can, express opinions or, grudges or concerns. It was something that was really under the radar. So it was, for them, it was a sort of a very free medium of expression, and it was empowering. It was a means of personal and maybe artistic expression. And to return to yesterday's keynote by Eugen Pfister, I think it was a political game because it does question the distribution and legitimacy of power on this small playground of school, but still. And this leads us to another kind of games, games that are sort of explicitly about politics. And the idea that games can be persuasive and express political ideas has been around for some time, and especially starting with Ian Bogast's book Persuasive Games in 2007. The examples that people gave of political games, there are some older examples, but usually sort of the stereotypical examples are September 12th, a pacifist game from 2003, Raid Gaza, sort of a pro-Palestinian, we could say, game from that was at the time of the conflict between Israel and Palestine in 2007, 8. So these are sort of the prototypical examples. However, in late 1980s Czechoslovakia, there were also explicitly political games being made that protested the communist regime. And that is something that hasn't really been documented in many other countries, or maybe none. It depends on what your definition is, but we can talk about it later. Before we start talking about political games, I need to say a few more things about the context. So in the late 1980s, specifically, it was an interesting time in Eastern Europe. So you had in the Soviet Union Mikhail Gorbachev, who introduced these reforms, glasnost and perestroika, who kind of led to some sort of liberalization of the economic life and the social life. And also in Czechoslovakia, the national government reluctantly followed and loosened up the oppressive regime. They were much more conservative than the Soviets, the Czechoslovak Communist Party. But this didn't really appease the citizens at all. Quite the opposite. The citizens became less afraid to protest. And starting in 1988, people, and a lot of them young people, started going to demonstrations against the communist regime and for freedom of speech and so on. This happened in Prague and other Czechoslovak cities. And at the same time, underground opposition and samizdat, so the underground self-publishing, flourished. And the same can be said about games and political games. Games had the advantage of being possibly the least regulated medium in the country, just because the government and the authorities didn't consider them medium. Right? They had no idea that this could be a way of expressing political sentiments. They thought, computers are for calculating stuff. So in this atmosphere, several activist games were produced. And my first example is a game called Reconstruction from 1988. This was a game in which the player finds him or herself in this anonymous town, and you don't know it at the beginning, but you find out that the goal of this game is to destroy a statue of Lenin, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who was sort of like this figurehead of communist ideology. So, the game is pretty interesting, but like what I found most exciting about it is that upon the completion of this game, it's a text-adventure game, the game actually explicitly invites you to take part in an anti-regime demonstration. It says, "Congratulations once more. We will all meet on August 21st on Old Town Square or anywhere else." And this date in 1988 was the 20th anniversary of the occupation of the country by the Soviet troops, who were still stationed. After 1968, they were still stationed in the country. And this was also the date of big anti-regime demonstrations. Most of these games were, for obvious reasons, released anonymously. But with this one, I actually managed to track down the guy who made it, Jaroslav Švelch, who was actually a well-known coder. He has made some of the fast-paced action games that I mentioned. He was very good at programming in machine code. But this game, he says, I was so ingenious that in order for the secret police not to catch me, I made the game awfully primitive. So he gave up all these programming tricks and sort of trademark, loaders and stuff like that, and he made like a very kind of basic game in the language BASIC. And he says it was a naive protest of sorts. He felt frustrated by the regime, by the fact that he doesn't have access to technology, that he have very bleak career prospects, and no bright future ahead of him, and so on. Back then, he was 18 years old. The next game I want to talk about is, and the last one, before I actually get to it, I have to say a few things about this other demonstration. This took place in Prague in January 1989, and it was called the Palach Week. It was organized to commemorate the anniversary of the self-immolation of Jan Palach, who set himself on fire in 1969 to protest the political changes after 1968. The protests went on for a week, and they were brutally suppressed by the police. And this was one of the last straws. It really undermined the legitimacy of the communist regime in the country, because people could, for the first time, really see what it's capable of beating people up, which wasn't really, it didn't really happen that often. But this was sort of like a large-scale demonstration that ended in violence. And there was a game made about it, called The Adventures of Indiana Jones in Wenceslas Square in Prague on January 16, 1989. So as I said, Indiana Jones was this sort of iconic Western hero, and in this satirical game, I would say, Indiana Jones finds himself on Wenceslas Square, right here, with the people who came to demonstrate. It's a game that's, there's a lot of exaggeration, there's a lot of satire. It's a very violent game, and it's violent both, there's both violence that is experienced and violence that is being executed. It's a very tough game too, so it represents Wenceslas Square really as a battlefield. This is one of the death scenes. The death scenes in this game are very elaborate. Okay, you are standing at an unobstructed entrance into the subway. As soon as you showed up, an officer came to you and searched you. Having found nothing, he called on his comrades and they beat you senseless. As they were running away to deal with some woman with a baby carriage, one of them lost a machete. You crawled for it and committed harakiri. Indiana Jones is dead. And there are many more, fun, but very violent death scenes in this game. At the same time, you also get to commit violence on the cops. You're standing in front of the grocery house department store. The entrance into the subway is fortunately clear. An annoying man, probably a communist, is looking out of a balcony and happily watching the good work of the members of the public security, which was sort of the somewhat euphemistic name for the police in Czechoslovakia. You can go down to the right or inside, you see a cop. So I will type, use axe, because I had picked an axe before. You drove your axe so deep inside his skull that it cannot be pulled out. You see a dead cop. And it goes on, and you sort of get to kill these cops, and eventually you get into the airport and you flee the country. Interestingly, the weapons that Indiana Jones uses in this game are usually they're weapons of the street. So he finds an axe and he uses an axe, or he throws rocks, but he doesn't really shoot them. So I think the game does a really good job of kind of putting Indiana Jones or the player into the shoes of the people who demonstrated. Although, I mean, as I said, it was exaggerated. So in this game, once again, you can sort of relive this frustrating experience and assert your agency over the events. The last example, I was lying. It was not the last example. I'll give one more. There was a game, actually, you might remember the Velvet Revolution on November 17th, 1989, which was really the last straw. A peaceful demonstration was once again brutally suppressed by the police. And 2 days after, this game was made, called simply just 7/11/1989, which fictionalized the events of the demonstration. I just use this to point out that, if we believe the screenshot, if we believe, what actually the paratext in the game, it was actually released 2 days after the fact. So it was sort of like a very fast way of responding to what was happening. And it was also like a part of the ecosystem of sort of other protest media, such as samizdat and leaflets and other things. Probably with less impact. Well, quite surely with less impact, but still, games were considered like a suitable means of expression of these concerns. So we're getting towards the end, and we can think. So what do you think of these obscure, strange, and wonderful games, hyperlocal and activist, that were made in 1980s Czechoslovakia? So one way to go would be to take this sensationalist and exceptionalist approach, and I could say, look at these amazing Czechoslovak games. They're so unlike everything else. And I don't actually think that's the way to go, because I'm not too much of a nationalist, and because I think that there were probably similar games made in different countries. It's just that nobody has really researched it. I believe that this is, sorry about that. I believe that this is more of a proof that games have always been indie, in a way. They had always been ready to be hyperlocal and activist, and this potential might have been overshadowed by the volume of commercial production. Games have always been around, but the game industry is not a default, natural state of things. And I sometimes get surprised by students. I have taught game studies for about 8 years now, and I get surprised by to what extent students think that the industry is the natural state of things. But I don't think that's the case. Like, indie doesn't really have to be an alternative. It actually is like probably the original way of making and playing games, especially when we go before digital and computer games and we go to other kinds of games. So when I say we have always been indie, I don't mean we as Czechs or Slovaks or Czechoslovaks, but we as all of us who play and make games. There's one question that has been posed to me before, and I think it's an interesting question. they asked, so would you advocate for a return of communism? Like when people back then were creating like these amazing games, like these really kind of inventive games. And I'm like, no way, I don't want to say that. I just think that these games are really interesting for analytical purposes because Czechoslovakia was a reservation of sorts for these pre-industrial and extra-industrial practices because there was no market. And I think that this kind of free, open-minded environments can be replicated elsewhere. It's present at some game jams, at game design schools, in local game design communities. I think that looking back at these, okay, so this is my attitude. I think looking back at these little games, we can see the breadth of things that games can express, of what games can do. Hyperlocal and activist games weren't some kind of high-concept, artistic games. It was very natural for the people to write games like that. They were simple expressions of their authors' experiences, ideas, and opinions. And to get back to the quote that I used, they were what made sense to us and our audience. It's just that their authors weren't limited by some arbitrary ideas of how to do things right and what games should be about. So therefore, I suggest that we don't treat so-called indie games as this fresh, new alternative to mainstream games. Games have always been around and available as a means of expression for personal, political expression. We have always been indie, and that's it for me. Thank you very much.